I'm really, really hot.
That was fresh.
I'm really, really hot.
Here we go. Fucking with the best.
Everybody clap your hands. Everybody clap your hands. Everybody clap your hands. Everybody.
Welcome back to Conscious Fever, hosted by Carl Pride.
I'm really, really hot.
That was fresh.
I'm really, really hot.
Here we go. Fucking with the best.
Everybody clap your hands. Everybody clap your hands. Everybody clap your hands. Everybody.
Welcome back to Conscious Fever, hosted by Carl Pride.
I'm really, really hot.
That was fresh.
I'm really, really hot.
Here we go.
Welcome to the Conscious Fever podcast, hosted by Carl Price and Paul Mullins. Coming to you live from Louisville, Kentucky.
Conscious Fever, hosted by Carl Price.
Either way, I don't give a damn what you think you are entitled to.
Ladies and gentlemen, the moment you've been waiting for. So listen responsibly.
It's the best of the best. It's the one and only DJ Ice, Louisville's coldest DJ.
Hey, thank you. All right, thank you. I think the applause is so much because we've been gone for so long, probably about a month. My apologies, but we just simply needed to handle some business, right? So, anyway, I'm Carl Price. This is Conscious Fever here on Ice Entertainment Television, Conscious Fever Radio. Yes, we are still on the air. We are still live, and we appreciate you all joining us. Listen, we have a really good show tonight. I'm going to talk about something that should have bothered everybody on July 21st, 2025. It was the sentencing of Brett Hankison, okay? The former Louisville Metro Police Department detective. And of course, I've been full disclosure. You know, I know Hankison. I really do think he's a nice guy, but when it comes to the justice system, sometimes we have to talk about it, and unfortunately Hankison is in the crossfire. As I present this piece on echoes of Jim Crow and the Hankison trial, I want you all to keep in mind just a couple of things. One thing is, and then I'll talk to y'all about my shiny face before I get off the air, okay? But one thing is that we all need to pay attention. We need to pay attention to the Justice Department, the United States Department of Justice. Of course, you know the story now. They sent prosecutors in to say, just give him one day. We don't want to prosecute this guy. And it made me think about those days of Jim Crow, which I was not around, but there are some of you who are watching who were actually around. And so it just brought everything back, all the trials that I've watched, all the stuff that I've looked at over the time, you know, as a lawyer, as a non-lawyer, when I would look at these old cases, and I see Deacon Stevenson on, and he's a testament of that. You know, he lived through the Jim Crow days and the days of separate but equal. But we're going to talk about some of that tonight. I'm going to say hello, Madeline Morrison. We've been gone for a while. Good evening to everyone. Well, anyway, we're going to talk about the echoes of Jim Crow, the echoes that we heard in the federal courthouse here on West Broadway here in Louisville. I will tell you all, now you can't say hi to Paul tonight, Madeline, because Paul is not here tonight. Paul, actually, we've had some other engagements that we needed to do. I travel, a little bit travel here, a little bit travel there. And then next week, unfortunately, I'm going to be in Chicago for the National Bar Association meeting, which is a meeting of all the National Black Lawyers. And this is the 100th anniversary, so I have to go. So no show next week. But Paul's not here tonight because Paul has laryngitis, and he's had it for about a week. He finally was convinced today that he should go to the doctor. Paul never goes to the doctor. He's one of those, yes. So he's gonna, I'll talk with him after the show probably or tomorrow morning, and he'll tell me how his doctor visit went. But in any case, but he's not here tonight. But we are tonight going to talk about the echoes of Jim Crow. The echoes of Jim Crow. I hope I don't bore you all with this, but listen, I want y'all to listen very closely to the story that I want to tell. And I'm not reading anything. I'm not trying to remember it, but I'm trying to remember everything. Okay? And I remember all of this stuff that I talked about and that I studied on all of these cases. Florida, New Orleans, Virginia, Alabama. So I want to talk about that, and I want y'all to just be educated just for a little bit, as we talk about this. Anyway, but I'm Carl Price. This is Conscious Fever here on Ice Entertainment Television, Conscious Fever Radio. Don't go anywhere, because when I come back, we are going to talk about the echoes of Jim Crow in the federal courthouse on July 21st, 2025 here in Louisville, Kentucky. I'll be right back.
She a cause, you see. 4 cars deep, we'll come through on a late night. Chicken spot, wings and fries, we call that a day night. Lights on, sold out, I don't have no stage fright. Knew that I was built for this forever, ever, ever.
You are listening to Conscious Fever, hosted by Carl Price.
We ride bands, 10 times 10, all my friends, this for real.
And we are back with more Conscious Fever, hosted by Carl Price, Esquire.
Hey, welcome back to Conscious Fever. On July 21st, 2025, in a federal courthouse in Louisville, Kentucky, we witnessed something that should have shocked the conscience of every American who believes in equal justice under law. Former Louisville Metro Police Detective Brett Hankinson, a white man convicted of violating the civil rights of Breonna Taylor, a black woman, during a botched police raid, stood before a federal judge for sentencing. But in that courtroom, the most disturbing spectacle was not the defendant in the dock. It was the prosecutors at the government's table. These federal prosecutors, representing the United States of America, stood before Judge Rebecca Grady Jennings and argued passionately not for justice for Breonna Taylor, not for accountability for her death, but for mercy for the police officer convicted of violating her civil rights that led to her death. They recommended that Brett Hankinson serve just 1 day in prison, one single day, for firing 10 bullets blindly through the apartment of a sleeping black woman, violating her constitutional rights in the process that led to her death. As Tamika Palmer, Breonna Taylor's mother, said outside that courthouse, there was no prosecution in there for us. There was no prosecution in there for Breonna. Brett had his own defense team. I didn't know he needed another one. Her words cut to the heart of a betrayal that runs deeper than one case, deeper than one moment, deeper than one prosecutor's recommendation. They reveal a pattern that stretches back through the darkest chapters of American history. A pattern where the government itself becomes an advocate, not for justice, but for the very people who perpetrate violence against Black Americans. This is Echoes of Jim Crow, how the Hankinson sentencing reveals the enduring pattern of prosecutorial advocacy for some white offenders. What happened in the Louisville courtroom on July 21st, 2025 on West Broadway was not an aberration. It was an echo, a haunting echo of a prosecutorial tradition that flourished in the Jim Crow South, where government lawyers routinely advocated for lenient treatment for white defendants who committed crimes against black victims. It was an echo of a time when the scales of justice were not merely titled, but deliberately weighed to ensure that white offenders faced minimal consequences for violence against black bodies. I ask this question: is this the Make America Great Again coming to fruition? Tonight, I want to take a moment and draw the connections between that shameful moment here in Louisville and 5 historical cases from the Jim Crow era. Cases that reveal how prosecutors in the American South consistently served as advocates for white defendants rather than champions of justice for black victims. These cases, spanning from 1900 to 1968 across the states of Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Virginia, and Louisiana, demonstrate that that pretty much what we witnessed in the Hankinson sentencing was not a departure from American prosecutorial tradition, but a return to it. Is this the Make America Great Again coming to fruition? The thread that connects Brett Hankinson to the white defendants of the Jim Crow South is not merely the color of their skin. It is the color of the justice they received. In each case, we see prosecutors who view their role not as seekers of truth or champions of victims, but as protectors of white defendants and guardians of a racial hierarchy that placed white lives and white freedom above black lives and black justice. Here's case number 1. The killing fields of Jefferson County, Alabama, 1932 to 1968. Let us begin our journey through this dark past in Jefferson County, Alabama, where Birmingham, the largest city in the state, became a laboratory for the kind of prosecutorial indifference that would echo in Louisville nearly a century later. Between 1932 and 1968, white police officers in Jefferson County killed 123 black people, 123 human beings, 123 sons and daughters and fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters, 123 lives cut short by those sworn to protect and serve. And how did the prosecutors respond to this epidemic of violence? With a pattern of advocacy that would make the Trump Justice Department's recommendation for Brett Hankinson seem almost progressive by comparison. Of those 123 killings, prosecutors brought charges against the white officers in exactly 2 cases. 2 cases out of 123 deaths. And of those 2 prosecutions, not a single one resulted in a conviction. Not one. But the story begins and becomes even more chilling when we examine the career of James Albert Hale Jr., a white Birmingham police patrolman whose story reads like a blueprint for the kind of prosecutorial protection that Brett Hankinson would receive decades later. Between 1943 and 1950, Hale killed 5 black men, 5 separate human beings, each with their own story, their own family, their own dreams cut short by Hale's gun. Consider the victims. Knox Fale, approximately 40 years old, killed in 1943. Harrison Lee, a 39-year-old barbershop owner, killed in 1946. John Johnson, a 42-year-old father of 9 children, shot and killed in an alley in 1948 with no explanation given for why police had stopped him. Thuris Rudolph Wood, just 19 years old, shot in the back of the head while fleeing in 1948. Eugene Burt, a 46-year-old butler, shot and killed in his own home in 1950 with no witnesses except Hale himself. In each case, the Jefferson County, Alabama coroner ruled the death a, quote, justifiable homicide, close quote. In each case, prosecutors declined to bring charges. In each case, the government's response was not to seek justice for the victims, but to provide cover for the killer. And what was James Albert Hale Jr.'s reward for this spree of violence, you ask? In 1951, 1 year after his final killing, the Birmingham Police Department promoted him to detective. 10 years later, they promoted him again to sergeant. This was not prosecutorial negligence. This was prosecutorial advocacy. Just as the Trump Justice Administration and that department would argue in 2025 that Brett Hankison, quote, did not shoot Miss Taylor and is not otherwise responsible for her death, close quote. The prosecutors of Jefferson County, Alabama, crafted a narrative that absolved white officers of responsibility for Black death, just as prosecutors would recommend 1 day in prison for Hankison. Alabama prosecutors recommended no days at all for Hale and his colleagues. The parallels are unmistakable. In both cases, we see prosecutors who view their role not as advocates for victims, but as prosecutors and protectors of white defendants in both cases. We see a justice system that treated Black lives as expendable and white careers as precious. In both cases, we see the government itself becoming complicit in the very violence it was supposed to prosecute. The context makes these parallels even more disturbing. During the peak years of Hale's killing spree, Birmingham was under the control of Eugene Bull Connor. You've heard that name before. The Commissioner of Public Safety, who would later become infamous for turning fire hoses on and attack dogs on civil rights protesters. In 1948, the year Hale killed both John Johnson and theorist Rudolph Wood, Connor led the political convention of the newly formed Dixiecrat Party, which opposed anti-lynching laws and civil rights reforms. You see a parallel at all? That same year, police killings of Black men in Jefferson County peaked at 16 deaths. This was not coincidence. This was policy. The prosecutors who declined to charge Hale and his colleagues were not failing in their duties. They were fulfilling them exactly as the legal white power Jim Crow structure intended. Their job was not to seek justice for Black victims, but to ensure that white officers could kill Black people with impunity. Their advocacy was not for the rule of law, but for the preservation of racial hierarchy. When we fast forward to July 21st, 2025, and hear federal prosecutors arguing that Brett Hankison should serve only 1 day in prison, we are hearing the same voice that echoed through the courtrooms of Jim Crow, Alabama. We are witnessing the same prosecutorial tradition that treated Black death as acceptable and white accountability as unthinkable. The only difference is that in 1950, prosecutors didn't even pretend to seek justice. They simply refused to prosecute at all. How about case number 2, the Elaine Massacre and Moore versus Dempsey from Arkansas, 1919 to 1923. From the killing fields of Alabama, let's travel to Phillips County, Arkansas, where in 1919, another chapter in prosecutorial advocacy for white defendants was written in blood. The Elaine Race Massacre, as it came to be known, began with the meeting of Black sharecroppers seeking fair wages for their cotton. It ended with the deaths of an estimated 200 to 1,000 Black people at the hands of white mobs and federal troops. But focus tonight is not on the massacre itself. It is on what happened in the courtroom afterward, where prosecutors demonstrated the same pattern of advocacy for white interest that we will see in Louisville more than a century later. In the aftermath of the massacre, over 700 Black people were arrested. 67 were sent to prison, and 12 Black farmers were charged with the murder of 5 white men who had died during the violence. Some, according to later evidence, probably shot accidentally by other whites in the chaos. These 12 men became the defendants in what would become known as Moore versus Dempsey, a case that would eventually reach the Supreme Court and exposed the depths of prosecutorial bias in the Jim Crow system. The trials of these 12 Black farmers were not trials at all. They were theatrical performances designed to provide a veneer of legality to what was essentially a lynching. The prosecutors who brought these cases were not seeking justice. They were orchestrating a spectacle that would satisfy the white mob's thirst for black blood while maintaining the fiction of due process. Consider the scene just for a second. As the trials proceeded, a white mob surrounded the courthouse, shouting threats that if the accused black men were not sentenced to death, the mob would lynch them. The prosecutors, rather than requesting protection for the defendants or a change of venue, proceeded with the trials as if this intimidation was perfectly acceptable. They called witnesses who had been tortured into confessing or testifying against the defendants. They presented evidence obtained through what can only be described as systematic brutality. Alf Banks, one of the 12 defendants, later described the treatment he received, quote, "I was frequently whipped and also put in an electric chair, and shocked and strangling drugs would be put in my nose to make me tell the others that the others had killed or shot at white people and to force me to testify against them," close quote. This was a foundation upon which the prosecutors built their cases: torture, coercion, and terror. The all-white juries, operating under the watchful eyes of the mob outside, deliberated for less than 8 minutes per defendant. 8 minutes to decide whether a human being should live or die. 8 minutes to weigh evidence obtained through torture. 8 minutes to deliver the verdict that the mob demanded. Each defendant was found guilty. The judge dutifully sentenced all 12 to death. The mob cheered. And what was the prosecutor's response to this travesty? They defended it. When the case was appealed, when evidence of the torture and mob intimidation came to light, when it became clear that these trials were nothing more than legal lynchings, the prosecutors fought to uphold the convictions. They argued that the proceedings had been fair, that the evidence was sound, that justice had been served. This is the same prosecutorial mindset that we saw in Louisville on July 21st, 2025. Just as Arkansas prosecutors in 1919 viewed their role as satisfying white demands for black punishment rather than seeking actual justice, federal prosecutors in 2025 view their role as protecting a white defendant rather than advocating for a black victim. Just as Arkansas prosecutors were willing to accept evidence obtained through torture to convict black defendants, federal prosecutors were willing to ignore the evidence of Hankinson's reckless violence to recommend his virtual freedom. But get this, the parallel becomes even more striking when we consider the aftermath. In Arkansas, it took the intervention of the NAACP, led by Walter White, to expose the truth about these trials. White, a black man light enough to pass for white, traveled to Arkansas posing as a newspaper reporter and uncovered the systematic torture and intimidation that had characterized the proceedings. It was only through his outrage and his courage and the NAACP's legal advocacy that the case eventually reached the United States Supreme Court, which in 1923 overturned the convictions in a landmark decision. But this was after the death of these 12 men. But here's the crucial point. The prosecutors never acknowledged their wrongdoing. Just like today, they never admitted that they had participated in a system of racial terror. They never expressed regret for their role in what Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes would describe as trials where, and I quote the great Supreme Court Justice, trials where counsel, jury, and judge were swept to the fatal end by an irresistible tide of public passion. Even when the Supreme Court ruled that the trials had been fundamentally unfair, the prosecutors maintained that they had simply been doing their jobs. This is the prosecutorial tradition that Brett Hankinson inherited, a tradition where prosecutors see themselves not as servants of justice, but as servants of white supremacy. When federal prosecutors stood before Judge Jennings and argued that Hankinson should serve only 1 day in prison, they were channeling the same spirit that animated their predecessors in Arkansas a century earlier. They were prioritizing the protection of a white defendant over the pursuit of justice for a black victim. They were treating black death as acceptable and white accountability as optional. The only difference is that in 1919, the prosecutors didn't even pretend to care about the black victims. In 2025, they at least had to go through the motions of acknowledging Breonna Taylor's death before arguing that this individual who participated in violating her civil rights that led to her death deserved mercy. Progress, perhaps, but progress measured in the thinnest of margins. How about case number 3, the Groveland Four and prosecutorial complicity in Florida, 1949. Our journey through this prosecutorial advocacy for white defendants and indifference in black victims now takes us to Groveland, Florida, in 1949, where we encounter a case that demonstrates how prosecutors could become active participants in racial terror while maintaining the facade of legal proceedings. The case of the Groveland Four reveals a prosecutorial system so corrupted by racial bias that it became indistinguishable from the lynch mobs it was supposed to replace. On July 16, 1949, 4 young black men, Charles Greenlee, 16 years old, Walter Irvin, 22 years old, Sam Shepard, 22 years old, and Ernest Thomas were accused of raping a 17-year-old white woman named Norma Paget in Lake County, Florida. What followed was not a pursuit of justice, but a carefully orchestrated campaign of terror in which prosecutors played a central role, demonstrating the same pattern of advocacy for white interests over black lives that we will witness in the Hankinson case decades later. The prosecutorial response to these accusations reveals a mindset that prioritized white vengeance over black justice. Rather than conducting a thorough investigation, rather than ensuring the safety of the accused, rather than upholding the constitutional rights of the defendants, prosecutors became partners with the mob that demanded black blood. Ernest Thomas never made it to trial. He was shot and killed by a white mob before he could be arrested. A lynching that prosecutors treated not as a crime to be investigated, but as a problem solved. There was no serious effort to identify or prosecute Thomas's killers. There was no condemnation of the mob violence. There was only silence, the same kind of prosecutorial silence that would greet the torture and killing of black suspects throughout the Jim Crow era. The 3 surviving defendants, Greenlee, Irvin, and Shepard, faced trials that were predetermined in their outcomes, of course. The prosecutors who brought these cases were not seeking truth. They were seeking to satisfy white demands for black punishment. They presented evidence that was questionable at best, fabricated at worst. They relied on testimony from witnesses whose credibility was never seriously challenged. They operated in a system where the presumption of innocence applied only to white defendants. But the most damning evidence of prosecutorial complicity came not during the trials, but afterward. In November 1951, while Irvin and Shepard were being transported by Sheriff Willis McCall, the sheriff claimed they had attempted to escape and shot both men. Shepard was killed instantly. Irvin, though wounded, survived and later testified that there had been no escape attempt, that McCall had simply stopped the car and shot them in cold blood. Here we see the ultimate expression of prosecutorial advocacy for white defendants. When the legal system failed to deliver the death sentences that white supremacists demanded quickly enough, the prosecutors were willing to look the other way while law enforcement officers took matters in their own hands. Of course, Sheriff McCall was never prosecuted for what was clearly an attempted double murder. Instead, he was treated as a hero by the white community and continued to serve as sheriff for decades. This prosecutorial complicity in extrajudicial killing mirrors exactly what we see in the Hankinson case. Just as Florida prosecutors in 1949 were willing to accept the killing of black defendants by white law enforcement officers, federal prosecutors in 2025 were willing to accept the killing of Breonna Taylor by white police officers. Just as Florida prosecutors treated Sheriff McCall's violence as justified, federal prosecutors treated Hankinson's violence as understandable. The language used by prosecutors in both cases reveals the same underlying assumptions about the value of black life and the accountability of white defendants. In Florida, prosecutors described the shooting of Irvin and Shepard as an unfortunate but necessary response to their alleged escape attempt, despite clear evidence that no such attempt had occurred. In Louisville, federal prosecutors described Hankinson's actions as misguided but not malicious, arguing that, quote, defendant Hankinson did not shoot Ms. Taylor and is not otherwise responsible for her death, close quote, despite the fact that his reckless gunfire was part of the raid that killed her. In both cases, prosecutors crafted narratives that minimized white culpability while ignoring black suffering. In both cases, they treated the deaths of black people as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of white interests. In both cases, they demonstrated that their primary loyalty was not to justice, but to the preservation of racial hierarchy. The Groveland Ford case also reveals how prosecutorial bias could persist across decades, immune to changing social conditions or legal precedents. It was not until 2021, 72 years after the original accusations, that a Florida prosecutor finally acknowledged the injustice of the case and moved to have the charges dismissed. For 7 decades, the prosecutorial establishment maintained the fiction that justice had been served, that the trials had been fair, that the system had worked as intended. The same institutional resistance to acknowledging prosecutorial misconduct characterizes the response to the Hankinson case. Even as Judge Jennings expressed her dismay at the Justice Department's recommendation, even as Breonna Taylor's family condemned the prosecutor's advocacy for their daughter's killer, the prosecutorial establishment has shown no willingness to examine how its own biases contributed to this miscarriage of justice. The thread that connects the prosecutors of Groveland in 1949 to the prosecutors of Louisville in 2025 is not merely their willingness to advocate for white defendants. It is their fundamental inability to see black victims as deserving of justice. In both cases, prosecutors operated from the assumption that black lives were expendable, that black deaths were acceptable, that black families were unworthy of the full protection of the law. When those prosecutors stood before Judge Jennings and argued that Brett Hankinson deserved mercy, they were speaking in the same voice that had echoed through Florida courtrooms for generations, the voice of a prosecutorial tradition that had always prioritized white comfort over black justice, white freedom over black life, white impunity over black accountability. Yeah. From the swamps of Florida, let's travel north to Martinsville, Virginia, where in 1949 we encounter perhaps the most systematic example of prosecutorial advocacy for white interest. Disguised as the pursuit of justice, the case of the Martinsville 7 demonstrates how prosecutors could transform the courtroom itself into a lynching ground, using the machinery of law to achieve the same results that mobs had once accomplished with rope and fire. What am I talking about? On January 8, 1949, 7 young black men, Francis DeSales Grayson, 37, Frank Hairston, Jr., 18, Howard Lee Hairston, 18, James Luther Hairston, 22, Joe Henry Hampton, 19, Booker T. Milner, 22, and John Claiborne Taylor, 21, were accused of raping a white woman named Ruby Stroud Floyd. What followed was not a search for truth, but a carefully orchestrated legal execution that would demonstrate the same prosecutorial bias that we will witness in the Hankinson case more than 7 decades later. The prosecutors who handled the Martinsville 7 case were not interested in justice. They were interested in death. They conducted 6 separate trials, each before an all-white, all-male jury, each designed to produce the same predetermined outcome. They interrogated the defendants without providing adequate legal counsel. They presented evidence that was questionable and testimony that was coerced. They operated within a system where the death penalty was routinely imposed on black defendants accused of crimes against white defendants, but never imposed on white defendants accused of similar crimes against black victims. The speed with which these trials proceeded reveals the prosecutorial mindset at work. These were not careful deliberations designed to uncover truth. They were assembly line proceedings designed to produce death sentences. The prosecutors treated the defendants not as human beings entitled to due process, but as problems to be solved through execution. They showed the same callous disregard for black life that federal prosecutors would display when they recommended 1 day in prison for Brett Hankinson. Judge Kenan Whittle, who presided over these trials, became a willing participant in what can only be described as legal lynching. Under his supervision, prosecutors were allowed to present cases that were built more on racial prejudice than on evidence. The trials proceeded with a speed that made meaningful defense impossible and with a bias that made acquittable unthinkable. All 7 men were sentenced to death. All 7 were executed on February 2nd and 5th, 1951. And throughout this process, prosecutors maintained that justice was being served, that the system was working as intended, that the rule of law was being upheld. The parallels, however, to the Hankinson case are unmistakable. Although they operated in reverse, where Virginia prosecutors in 1949 sought the harshest possible punishment for black defendants accused of crimes against a white victim, federal prosecutors in 2025 sought the most lenient possible punishment for a white defendant convicted of crimes against a black victim. Where Virginia prosecutors treated black lives as forfeit, federal prosecutors treated white accountability as optional. Where Virginia prosecutors saw their role as satisfying white demands for black death, federal prosecutors saw their role as protecting white defendants from black justice. But the underlying prosecutorial philosophy is identical. The belief that the criminal justice system exists not to serve justice equally, but to maintain racial hierarchy. In 1949, that meant ensuring that black men accused of crimes against white women faced death. In 2025, that meant ensuring that white men convicted of crimes against black women faced freedom. The case of the Martinsville 7 also reveals how prosecutorial bias could be institutionalized and systematized, right? Just all a part of the system. This was not the work of a few rogue prosecutors. This was the normal operation of a justice system designed to serve white supremacy. The prosecutors who sought death sentences for the Martinsville 7 were not violating their professional obligations. They were fulfilling them exactly as the Justice Department would today and the structure intended. Statistically, statistical evidence presented in later appeals revealed the systematic nature of the bias, of this particular bias. In Virginia, no white man had ever been executed for rape. The death penalty for this crime was reserved exclusively for black defendants, particularly those accused of crimes against white victims. The prosecutors who sought death for the Martinsville 7 were not pursuing justice. They were enforcing a racial caste system that treated black life as expendable and white victimhood as sacred. When we examine the language used by prosecutors, in both cases, we see the same underlying assumptions about race and justice. Virginia prosecutors in 1949, they spoke of the need to protect white womanhood and maintain social order, code words for preserving white supremacy. Federal prosecutors in 2025 spoke of the need to consider Hankinson's intent and circumstances, code words for protecting the privilege. In both cases, prosecutors demonstrated a fundamental inability to see black victims as a fully human. The Martinsville 7 were reduced to racial stereotypes and sexual threats. Breonna Taylor was reduced to collateral damage in a drug investigation. In both cases, black humanity was erased in service of white interests. The institutional memory of prosecutorial bias also connects these cases across the decades. The same prosecutorial culture that produced the Martinsville 7 trials, a culture that prioritized white interests over black justice, survived the civil rights movement, survived integration of law schools, survived the election of black prosecutors. It adapted and evolved, but it never disappeared. When federal prosecutors stood before Judge Rebecca Jennings and argued for leniency for Brett Hankinson, they were drawing on the institutional memory. They were channeling a prosecutorial tradition that had always treated white defendants as deserving of mercy and black victims as unworthy of justice. They were speaking in a voice that had echoed through Virginia courtrooms for generations, the voice of a legal system designed to serve white supremacy. Is this making America great again? The tragedy of the Martinsville 7 was not just that 7 innocent men were executed. It was that the prosecutors who killed them never acknowledged their crime. They went to their graves believing that they had served justice, that they had upheld the law, that they had done their duty. It was not until 2021, 70 years after the execution of that Virginia finally acknowledged the injustice and granted pardons after their they're dead and gone. The same institutionalized blindness characterizes the prosecutorial response to the Hankinson case. The federal prosecutors who recommended 1 day in prison for Breonna Taylor's ultimate participant in her killing showed no signs of recognizing the injustice of their position. They continue to believe that they are serving justice, that they are upholding the law, that they are doing their duty. But history will judge them as it has judged the prosecutors of the Martinsville 7, as servants not of justice but of white supremacy, as advocates not for the rule of law but for the preservation of racial hierarchy, as prosecutors who forgot that their oath was to seek justice, not to protect the powerful from the consequences of their actions. The last case is the case of Robert Charles, or what is referred to as the Robert Charles riots and the prosecutorial silence in Louisiana in 1900. So let's take our final stop in this journey through prosecutorial advocacy for white defendants. It will take us to New Orleans, Louisiana in 1900, where the case of Robert Charles and its aftermath reveals the earliest patterns of prosecutorial bias that would echo through the Hankinson case more than a century later. The Robert Charles riots demonstrate how prosecutors could use silence as a weapon, how the absence of prosecution could be just as powerful as the presence of bias in prosecution in maintaining racial hierarchy. Here's the story. On July 23, 1900, Robert Charles, a black man, was sitting on a doorstep with a friend when they were approached by white police officers who demanded to know what they were doing. When Charles questioned the officer's authority to detain him without a cause, a struggle ensued. Charles was shot and wounded, but managed to escape. 3 days later, after a massive manhunt, Charles was cornered in a house and killed in a shootout with police and a white mob. But Charles's death was only the beginning of the violence. In the days that followed, white mobs rummaged through black neighborhoods in New Orleans, killing innocent black residents, destroying black-owned businesses, and terrorizing the entire black community. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 28 people, most of them black civilians who had nothing to do with the original incident. The violence was indiscriminate and lethal, targeting black New Orleans simply because of their race. And how did prosecutors respond to this orgy of racial violence? With silence, with inaction, with the deliberate decision to treat the mass murder of black civilians as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of white vengeance. No white participant in the mob violence were ever prosecuted. No white police officers were held accountable for their role in the killings. No white officials were charged with failing to protect black citizens. The prosecutorial response to the Robert Charles riots was not merely inadequate, it was non-existent. The prosecutorial silence was not an oversight, it was a policy. Prosecutors in New Orleans understood that their role was not to protect black citizens from white violence, but to protect white citizens from black resistance. They understood that their job was not to uphold the law equally, but to enforce a racial hierarchy that placed white lives above black lives, white interests above black rights, white comfort above black survival. The parallels to the Hankinson case are striking in their consistency across more than a century. Just as Louisiana prosecutors in 1900 used silence to protect white perpetrators of violence against black victims, federal prosecutors in 2025 used advocacy to protect a white perpetrator of violence against a black victim. Just as Louisiana prosecutors treated black death as acceptable, the federal prosecutors here in Louisville treated black justice as optional. The institutional culture that produced prosecutorial silence in 1900 New Orleans is the same culture that produced prosecutorial advocacy for Brett Hankinson in 2025 in Louisville. It is a culture that views prosecutors not as servants of justice, but as guardians of white privilege. It is a culture that treats black victims as unworthy of protection and white defendants as deserving of mercy. The Robert Charles case also reveals how prosecutorial bias could shape not just individual cases, but entire communities. Relationship with law enforcement. The community's relationship with law enforcement. The failure to prosecute the white mob participants sent a clear message to black New Orleans. And this was the message. The law would not protect them. The courts would not serve them. The prosecutors would not advocate for them. This message of prosecutorial abandonment would echo through generations, creating a legacy of distrust that persists to this day. When Breonna Taylor's family stood outside that Louisville courtroom and declared that there was no prosecution in there for us, they were expressing the same sense of prosecutorial abandonment that black New Orleans felt in 1900. They were recognizing that the prosecutors who were supposed to represent their interests had instead become advocates for their daughter's killer. The unbroken chain from Jim Crow to Louisville. Let me comment on that. The unbroken chain from Jim Crow to Louisville. As I reach the end of my journey through these 5 cases, from the killing fields of Alabama to the courtrooms of Arkansas, from the lynch mobs of Florida to the legal executions of Virginia, from the silent prosecutors of Louisiana to the advocate prosecutors of Kentucky, we see an unbroken chain of prosecutorial bias that stretches across more than a century of American history. This chain is forged not just by individual prosecutors making individual decisions, but by an institutional culture that has consistently prioritized white interests over black justice. It is a culture that has adapted to changing times and changing laws, but has never abandoned its fundamental commitment to protecting white defendants and abandoning black victims. The prosecutors who recommended 1 day in prison for Brett Hankinson were not breaking with American prosecutorial tradition. They were continuing it. They were channeling the same spirit that animated prosecutors in Jefferson County, Alabama, who refused to charge white officers who killed 123 black people. They were following the same playbook used by prosecutors in Phillips County, Arkansas, who defended mob-dominated trials and torture, obtained confessions. They were embracing the same philosophy that guided prosecutors in Lake County, Florida, who looked the other way while sheriffs murdered black defendants. They were speaking in the same voice that echoed through Martinsville, Virginia, where prosecutors sought death for black defendants accused of crimes against white victims. And they were practicing the same selective blindness that characterized prosecutors in New Orleans, Louisiana, who ignored white mob violence against black civilians. The common thread that runs through all these cases is not just racial bias. It is prosecutorial advocacy for white supremacy under the Trump administration. In each case, prosecutors understood their role not as seekers of truth or champions of justice, but as protectors of racial hierarchy. They saw themselves not as servants of the law, but as guardians of white privilege. This understanding shaped every aspect of their work. It determined which cases they brought and which they ignored. It influenced which evidence they presented and which they suppressed. It guided which arguments they made and which they avoided. It colored their view of victims and defendants, witnesses and juries, judges and appeals courts. Most importantly, it defined their understanding of justice itself. For these prosecutors, justice was not about equal treatment under law. It was about maintaining social order. It was not about protecting the innocent. It was about protecting the powerful. It was not about seeking truth. It was about preserving hierarchy. When federal prosecutors stood before Judge Jennings on July 21st, 2025, and argued that Brett Hankison deserved mercy, they were not just advocating for one defendant. They were defending an entire system of racial privilege. They were not just seeking a lenient sentence. They were seeking to preserve the principle that white lives matter more than black lives, that white freedom is more important than black justice, that white comfort takes precedence over black equality. Judge Jennings, to her credit, rejected this argument. She sentenced Hankison to 33 months in prison, far more than the 1 day recommended by the prosecutors. But her rejection of prosecutorial bias in this one case cannot erase the broader pattern of prosecutorial advocacy for white supremacy that stretches back through American history. The question we must ask ourselves is not whether Hankison's case represents a departure from American prosecutorial tradition. It clearly does not. The question is whether we are finally ready to break the chain of prosecutorial bias that has bound American justice for more than a century. Are we ready to demand prosecutors who see their role as seeking justice rather than protecting privilege? Are we ready to insist on a prosecutorial culture that values black lives as much as white lives? Are we ready to create a justice system that serves all Americans equally, regardless of race? The answer to those questions will determine whether the echo of Jim Crow that we heard in that Louisville courtroom on July 21st, 2025 will continue to reverberate through American justice, or whether it will finally be silenced by the sound of true equality under law. The choice is ours. The time is now. The question is whether we have the courage to break the chains that have bound American justice for far too long, or whether we will continue to allow the ghosts of Jim Crow to haunt our courtrooms for generations to come. As Breonna Taylor's mother said, Brett Hankison had his own defense team. He didn't need another one from the prosecutors who were supposed to represent justice. But until we fundamentally transform the culture of American prosecution, until we root out the institutional bias that has shaped prosecutorial decision-making for more than a century, until we demand that prosecutors serve justice rather than privilege, Breonna Taylor and countless other black victims will continue to find that they have no one in those courtrooms speaking for them. The echo of Jim Crow that we heard in Louisville was not an aberration. It was a reminder that the work of justice is never finished, that the fight for equality is never won, that the struggle against white supremacy must be waged in every generation, in every courtroom, in every prosecutor's office, across the nation. The question is not whether we will hear that echo again. We will. The question is whether we will finally find the courage to silence it once and for all. I ask this question: is this the Make America Great Again coming to fruition? This is Conscious Fever. I'm Carl Price on Ice Entertainment Television, Conscious Fever Radio. I'll be right back.
There are a lot of temptations facing young people today, like electronic cigarettes and skateboarding. Each vape pod can contain the same amount of nicotine as a pack of cigarettes. This can lead today's youth to a lifelong addiction and severe lung damage. Recall and consider the facts before making a poor decision.
The health class film guy isn't the best person to talk to your kid about vaping.
Got a few minutes?
You are. Start the conversation.
Hey, welcome back to Conscious Fever here on Ice Entertainment Television and Conscious Fever Radio. I am Carl Price, your host. Wow, that took a lot of my breath. I had to finish before I started this broadcast my watermelon juice. Listen, thank you all for churning in. Thank you all for listening to that. I think the producer was putting the comments up, and there's another one. I don't know where I'm supposed to be. Okay, right there. Yeah. And I'm looking at these, Carl. You must speak the facts, baby. Thank you. But this is something. I could have come on here tonight without Paul and talked about anything. There's so much stuff going on. I could have talked about anything. Of course, rest in peace. Malcolm Jamal Warner. Don't believe all the conspiracy theories about his death that you're reading on, that you might hear on social media. But I would just say this, that if you take anything from what you just heard me talk about, and I did my research, didn't need a lot of notes to talk about that, because when I heard what the prosecutors were doing down on West Broadway in the federal courthouse, it reminded me of all of these things that I studied many, many years ago. Actually, when I first started law school, started looking at slave cases and stuff like that, and Jim Crow cases. And all this stuff came back. So I'm truly asking the question, because I think for the last 12 years, a lot of people have been trying to determine what is Trump's definition of making America great again. I think that's what we're really still trying to figure out. Is this an example to send prosecutors from Washington to Louisville, Kentucky, to ask for 1 day for somebody who has been found guilty by his peers? Okay, I'm not going to comment on anything else other than the fact that once you get across the conviction line, then just an appropriate punishment is warranted, and not all the other BS. So I hope y'all would listen very carefully to what I said tonight and go back and review this show, because the analogy that I'm making is what I believe the Justice Department in the United States wants to do now. They want to run the Justice Department the same way it was ran during the Jim Crow era. The same way. And unfortunately, there are legislatures up there who are supposed to hold the president in check, and the judiciary is supposed to hold the president in check. None of them are going to do it. So we'll see how far this goes. Anyway, I appreciate each and every one of y'all for coming on. I've seen your comments. Okay, well, you do right. You do that. You tell her that. I think you're right. She needs to watch this. And please, Madeline, don't hesitate to share this show. I'm glad you think that I hit the mark. I saw quite a few comments while I was talking. Miss Bernie, Carl, job well done. No sugarcoating. Yeah, it's not about sugarcoating. It really isn't. It really isn't about sugarcoating, because you can't sugarcoat this stuff, because this stuff is real. And the reason I even decided to talk about this was because it's all in your faces. This stuff is all in our faces, and we are chosen not to do anything about it. We don't even talk about it. So I thought I would just take a moment to just spark the conversation about what's really, really out there, just in our face. Okay? This stuff is in our face. So anyway, this is the realest you've ever been, man. Okay, well, I don't mean to be that real, but I'm just trying to make the point. Now, I said I was going to talk about my shiny forehead, but I'm going to mess with the brightness here. Okay, so maybe make it go away. Okay, so I'm going to tell y'all something real quick before I get off this area, because I'm running out of time. So my barber had to have surgery on his foot, so he couldn't stand, so he couldn't cut my hair. So I went to another barber who was pretty good, by the way. But then, of course, with my age, I try to, transform the color of my hair. And I don't know, but I have something that I was around today or something at the barbershop this morning somewhere has caused me to break out. And I don't have allergies. Like, I don't have anything but cancer in 2010, and that's it. So I have no idea what that is. So that's why you see the shininess on my forehead, because I've been putting this cocoa butter. And El Shaddai, thank you, sir, for leaving this at the office once when you were there. It heals and softens, and this made my face feel so much better. Well, but for those of you who miss Paul, his glasses are here, so we'll make sure that he gets those when he comes back. I'll take these last few comments, and then I will get out of here. I actually can't say that Paul's going to get out of here because Paul's not here, but Paul was listening. I saw Paul. Paul made a comment. Oh, I'm glad you think she's going to be so proud. You're still looking fine, sir. Don't tell Paul, but you're sexy as hell. Paul is on here. I just want you to know. I appreciate you saying that I'm sexy. I don't really know what that means. It doesn't really, I mean, it's just another word. It's hurting you. Oh, it's hurting me, Madeline. Okay, I appreciate that. Hell, I guess. I mean, God, I guess I appreciate it. Anyway, I don't know if I'm supposed to do this. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so listen, I want to say thank you all for joining me tonight. We came on just a few minutes late, so we had to stay just a few minutes more, but we're right at that time where we have to get the men on to saying that a time is going to come. And I think the ending of our show is going to be so appropriate tonight because of what we talked about. There you go. Take up for me. Please take up for me. Leave the Lion King alone. And that's a good saying. Maybe I'll use that in a campaign or something, Lion King. Anyway, my name is Carl Price. This has been Conscious Fever here on Ice Entertainment Television, Conscious Fever Radio. Don't abandon us even when we're not here. We're always here. We're going to be here. I won't be here next week because I'll be in Chicago, and the crew doesn't want to go up to Chicago to tape the show on Thursday night. Actually, I've got to be at a Black Tie Affair next Thursday night, so I won't be available. But anyway, good night to you too, Stephanie. Well, good night, sir, and I will make sure your lioness comes home next time. It's so fun. Anyway, I'm Carl Price, Conscious Fever, Ice Entertainment Television. Thank you, DJ Ice, and Conscious Fever Radio. We love you. Tell somebody you love you. Smile at somebody tomorrow. We'll see you next time we come on. Have a good night.
Thank you for watching the Conscious Fever podcast. We will see you next week.
When you need the best sound, when you want the best songs, tune in. We're here for you. The best radio in town all day long.
I was born by the river in a little tent. Like the river I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. It's been too hard living, but I'm gonna die, 'cause I don't know what's up there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes, it is. Then I go to my brother. And I say, brother, help me please.
wind up knocking me back down on the knee. Oh, there've been times that I thought I couldn't last for long, but now I think I'm able, Father, to carry on. And it's been a long time coming, but I know change gonna come. Oh, yes it is, yes it is, yes it is. Said I know that a change is gonna come one day. I know a change